All right, what's up, everyone? Welcome to MTXChess. My name is Nathan. This is my first video I'm posting on this YouTube channel. My goal is really to reach out to people, teach chess. I'm a huge chess enthusiast, and this is just a hobby of mine. You've come to the right place if you're looking to learn some tips, learn some tricks, improve your chess game, learn how to play chess. Everyone's welcome. Please like, subscribe, and comment. And I just love to interact with you guys and look forward to hopefully playing some of you on chess.com. You can hit me up at MTXChess official on chess.com, and I'm more than happy to play at really any point. Today we're talking about how the pieces move, probably the most important thing to know to play chess well. So if you were an intermediate or advanced player, this video might be a review for you. But if you're new to chess, you're just looking at how to play, this is the right place. So right now, the way the board is set up, you can see this is how the board's set up to start. We'll get started by taking the pieces off the board and talking a little bit about the chessboard itself. So you can notice that it's 8x8, 64 squares, a mix of light and dark squares, same as a checkers board. One thing that's important to know when you start to play chess is that when you set a chessboard up, the bottom right-hand square should always be a light-colored square. If you're playing chess and it's a dark-colored square in this bottom right-hand corner, the board is set up wrong. You should stop, reset the board up. It'll get confusing if you set the board up incorrectly. Another important thing to know about the board is that is the terminology that chess players use for rows and columns. So usually, obviously, a row would be like down here, and a column would be going upwards. But chess players, we use the term rank and file. So rows are the ranks. They're numbered 1 through 8. And then files are the columns, and they're lettered A through H. So if we were to practice real quick identifying certain squares based on its rank and its file, we could pick this square. And whenever we name a square, we always name the letter first. So this is going to be F6, right? So that's where they connect. And when we do this, we're able to identify each square on the board. So if we were to say knight F6, we know now that there's a knight on F6. So enough about the chessboard. Let's get to pieces. So the first piece we'll start off with is the king. And the king is probably the easiest piece to understand its movement. The king can move in any direction it wants, but it can only move one square. So this king on E5 right here can move to any of these squares. If the king wanted to move to this square right here, how many moves do we think it would take the king? Well, there's a couple different ways he could get to this square, but it would take 1, 2, 3 moves, right? He could also go 1, 2, 3 moves. So there's a couple different ways the king could get to this square down here, G2. It's important to know that kings cannot move into check, and if kings are checked, they must move. Check basically means that the king is being attacked. So the king can't move into a square where he's under attack from an opponent's piece, and if he is under attack from an opponent's piece, the king either has to move, you have to block that check, or the checking piece needs to be captured. All right, enough about the king. Let's move on to the rook. The rook's a fun piece. So the rook can move it as far as it wants in any straight line. So this is where this rook can go. Pretty self-explanatory piece. It's important to know that rooks cannot jump over pieces. So you put a pawn here, this rook cannot get to this square. The rook first has to take the pawn, and then once the pawn is captured, it can move to that square. Alrighty, let's talk about the bishop. So like the rook, the bishop can move as far as it wants in the directions it's able to go, but instead of moving in straight lines, it can only move in diagonals. So this bishop can go on these squares. Notice that every square that this bishop can travel to is light squared. It's a light colored square. And that's because this bishop is a light colored bishop. At the beginning of every game, you start with 2 bishops, one light colored bishop and one dark colored bishop. And together, they can be very powerful. Oop, that's not correct. Together, they can be very powerful. You can see how many squares that they cover. All right, now that we know how the rook and the bishop move, we can start to talk about the queen. The queen is probably the most powerful piece in chess. And the queen can move like a rook, and then it can go as far as it wants in any straight direction. But it can also move like a bishop, and then it can go as far as it wants in any diagonal direction. What you'll notice about this queen is that unlike bishops, where bishops are stuck on a single color square, this queen can move in any diagonal in a dark color square, and then let's say she would have moved to a light color square. Now she can travel along the light square diagonals, okay? So let's do some practice. Let's say the queen wanted to move to this square right here. Can the queen get there? Well, the queen can't get there in one move, but the queen can definitely get there. So this square is not on any of the queen's diagonals. It's not on any of the queen's straight lines. But the way the queen could get here, I'll highlight the square again. The way the queen could get here is by moving here and then here, moving all the way down and then over, moving down a little bit and then going diagonally, moving across like this, and the queen could even go beyond the square, come back to the square, and even move away from the square and then come down to the square this way. So you can see queen, super powerful piece, lots of options available to the queen. The queen, like the rook, like the bishop, cannot jump over pieces. So if the queen wanted to get to any of these squares in one move, she's not able to. She'd first have to capture the pawn, and then these squares are available to her. Alrighty, let's talk now about the knight. The knight is an awesome piece, and it can go to these squares. Now, this might look kind of random, but I'll give you an easy way to think of how the knight moves. The way the knight moves is 1, 2, and then over in either direction. So whenever I'm thinking of how the knight is moving, that's how I'm always thinking about it. I'm always thinking of 1 square, 2 squares, and then over. And so with arrows, it looks like this. 1, 2, over, 1, 2, over. So you can see they move in kind of an L shape, and a couple knights together can be very strong, and they can be very tricky pieces. The great thing about knights, let's just put a couple pawns here. So obviously if we had a queen, a rook, or a bishop, we wouldn't be able to get them past these pawns. But with a knight, we can just jump straight over these pieces. We don't have to worry about it. So knights can just jump straight over, make some awesome pieces for getting deep into an opponent's position. Alrighty. The next pieces are pawns. So I'm putting some pawns down here on the second rank because this is where pawns always start. I'll put some black pawns on the board too. So the second rank, or the second row, is where all the pawns start in the game. And on the first time you move a pawn, and the very first move only, you have the option to move a pawn 2 squares forward. Again, this is optional. You don't have to do this. But if you wanted to, you can move this pawn up 2 squares. If you chose to move this pawn only 1 square, on your next move, you couldn't move this pawn 2 squares. You could also only move this pawn 1 square. So pawns move forward 1 square at a time, except when they're being moved on their very first move, they'll jump forward 2 squares. Let me just set up a fake position here. Let's say it was like this and it was white to move. Could white move any of these pawns? You remember that pawns move forward, but they don't capture forward. They're one of the few pieces in chess that actually capture differently than how they normally move. So pawns capture diagonally. So the squares I have highlighted are the squares being covered by this e5 pawn. Hypothetically, if black were to have a pawn here and black moved this pawn forward, white could capture this pawn. Okay? If we go back to that situation, right, where it was like this, this is a very super unique pawn move. It's called en passant. It's kind of an advanced move, but it's a fun one to show your friends. So normally black would move 1 square forward and they'd be captured. White would have the option to capture them. If black is on their second rank and white is on their 5th rank, and the black pawn jumps over the attack square of the white pawn, remember the white pawn's attacking this square, it's kind of unfair to white because they should have been able to capture, but black jumped over the attack square. What white has the option to do on the next move and the next move only is capture this pawn like this, and then this pawn is going to come off the board. Okay? That's called en passant. All right, so now we've talked about how all the pieces move. Let's talk about one more thing with pawns. One cool thing about pawns is that when they get to the end of the board, they're promoted. So if a pawn gets all the way to the end of the board like this, it wouldn't stay a pawn, but white or black, whoever's promoting the pawn, would get an opportunity to pick if they want a queen, if they want a rook, if they want a knight, or if they want a bishop. Most often, you promote to a queen. Pawns cannot remain pawns when they get to the end of the board, and pawns obviously can't turn to a king because you only get 1 king per game. So yeah, so that's basically how the pieces move. The next concept we'll talk about is, real quickly, we'll talk about what check means. So if we had the king here, and let's say we have a black bishop, right? So remember, bishops can move on their diagonals. So let's say this bishop moves to this square, right? We'll just move the bishop. Now it's white to move. After this bishop move here, now the king is in the line of attack from this bishop. So this king is in check. If white had another piece on the board and chose to move that piece, in theory, black would be able to take the king. But in chess, the kings never come off the board. If you're white, you're forced to move your king. And so the king can go to, let me put the king back on the board. The king can go to any square where he's no longer in check. So remember, the bishop can cover all of these squares. The king cannot move to this square because the king would still be in check. Similarly, the king cannot move to this square because he'd still be in check. So the squares that the king has available to him are these squares. And the king is forced to move to one of these squares. Let's say white had a pawn here. Instead of moving his king, white could block check with the pawn. That's one thing white could do. Let's say white had a knight here. Instead of moving his king, white could also capture the piece that is causing check, and that gets white out of check. Checkmate is when a king is in check and has no way of getting out of check. It's important to know that kings cannot move into check. So here's a rook, right? This rook moves across the board like this. This rook is effectively making a wall that the king cannot move into. If this white king wanted to move, he can move to any of these squares, but he cannot move into any of the squares covered by the rook. Alrighty, so today we covered checks, we covered how all the pieces move, we covered pawn promotion, and then the last thing we'll cover is just how the board is set up. So the way you remember how the board is set up is that the queen is always on the same color as her same color square as her color. So the white queen is always on a light colored square, and the dark queen is always on a dark colored square. Both sides start with 2 rooks, 2 knights, 2 bishops, a king, and a queen, and 8 pawns. The pawns always start on the second rank. So there you go. You're ready to start playing chess. If you're new to chess, welcome. It's just a great community. It's a fun game to play. Get out there and play as much as you can. Please like, subscribe, leave a comment, and looking forward to interacting with you. So yeah, thanks for watching MTX Chess. We'll be coming out with new videos every week. See you guys next time.